Hello, good morning. My name is Michael. We are in week 2 of our series called Lies, and the idea here is just to talk about a couple different things that act almost like viruses that get into the mind of an individual and begin to change the way we see things that actually does not lead to flourishing, that actually is a very negative effect to the human being. And so today we are talking about sex. I know they have signs everywhere, but this is going to be totally okay. Woody Allen, which is very ironic, wrote this, I don't know the question, but sex is definitely the answer. Oscar Wilde, the great author, wrote, everything in the world is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. There's a lot of different viewpoints on this, and I grew up in a generation where I was the bridge to a bunch of different things changing. You know, pre-internet, then dial-up, then everything's going quicker, and now to the point where if it, buffers for about 6 seconds, you yell at your spouse for not paying the thing on time. I digress. Anyways, the world has changed in a lot of different ways, and there's been no greater change that has happened than our views on sexuality. And we have seen this kind of sort of liberation, and yet we don't feel free. The sexual revolution has changed a lot of things to the point where these changes have caused a domino effect on what we think it means to be a human being. What do I mean by this? Well, sex has changed from no longer being connected to marriage. Sex has now been disconnected to marriage. But sex has also been disconnected to children, which is kind of an interesting thing for us to think about. All of these changes leading to a domino effect about how we think about what it means to be human, and this is what Paul wants to talk to us about today. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and Paul is talking to a church in Corinth. Corinth is a huge church. Think about it as the Vegas of the Roman Empire. It was a port city. It was a harbor town that had a lot of trade, and there was so much going on there. They were also known for their nightlife or their activities in that fashion. There was a huge sex industry in Corinth, to the point where somebody would say in ancient Roman times, they would look at somebody and they would say, man, you're such a Corinthian. And what they meant by that was, you are so sexually promiscuous. It became slang. That's how promiscuous that city was, to say, you are such a Corinthian. And that's the exact group that Paul wants to talk to about the topic of sex. So here we go. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 13 says this, food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. The church and sex. Probably so many of us have very different ideas about this, and many people reject Christianity not because of philosophical or scientific issues. Mainly their big problem is the church's view on sex. Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist philosopher, said this, the worst feature of the Christian religion is its attitude towards sex. People see it as antiquated or oppressive or not being with the times. Christopher Hitchens said this, the divorce between the sexual life and fear can now at last be attempted to be reconciled on the sole condition that we banish all religions from the discourse. In other words, if we're going to be able to talk about sex as a culture, we have to banish any kind of religious worldview on the issue. Now, the language of worldview is kind of interesting. N.T. Wright, who is a New Testament theologian and a historian, wrote that our worldviews are created by 4 different things all connected together. It is the questions that we ask, the stories that we tell, the symbols that we have, and the way that we do things, praxis. There's a story, and it's from Star Trek. It's the troubles with tribbles. I don't know anything about Star Trek. Anyways, the whole thing is that there's this planet, has a big farm, this guy has this farm, and these animals are destroying all of his grain. And every single one of these planets has this priority one signal to alarm the galaxy that something's going horribly, horribly wrong. So this guy, because he wants to protect his farm, hits the thing, and all of the galaxy's resources descend down to the planet, and they see that nothing's wrong. There's no huge catastrophic problem. It's just these animals eating his grain. And he goes, somebody do something about this. And what happens to them? They're like, why did you hit this? This is not what this is for. And what begins to happen is because this person misrepresented this symbol, now they can't trust how he uses any of the other alarms. This domino effect happens where one thing becomes distorted, all things become distorted. And that's what N.T. Wright's trying to say. He's trying to say if one symbol collapses, then the questions that we ask no longer can be trusted. The stories can all of a sudden be distorted. The way we do life is now different because the one domino has fallen and everything has gone with it. So Paul is going to hit two kind of views in this passage, and one is going to be, very, very religious, and the other one is going to be very, very worldly. Let's start with the worldly one first, this modern viewpoint of sex. Paul says this, food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. So what Paul's doing is he's comparing your sexual drive and desire to your hunger, the way that you feel about food. And what happens? You feel hungry, you eat. You have sexual desire, you have sex. Aren't those both the ways that you're naturally supposed to act? And Paul's kind of critiquing this thing because the way that you think about sex, if you think about it like food, I have an appetite and then I consume. I have a desire, and then I receive a product. If that's the way that we live and we treat sexuality that way, it's actually a very harmful way to do it. Think about it this way. Okay, Subway. We all love Subway, right? Probably a lot of us don't. Anyway, so we go to Subway. We're at Subway. And you go there. You're like, hey, what kind of bread do you want? And you're like, good bread. And they're like, what kind of veggies? You like the good veggies, whatever. Start picking everything. Don't, hold the tomato, put some jalapenos, spicy, like that. Get the sauce going, everything. Everything's going on the thing. I love it. And what are they doing? They're trying to gear all of my desires, all the things that I want. They're trying to put it on a sandwich because they're trying to satisfy some kind of a need that I have. There is a product that I create and that I choose, and it is geared towards what I want, and I consume that thing to satisfy me for a moment. Okay? The goal here and the thought and the idea is that sexuality is supposed to be the same thing. It is just towards our desires that we consume to satisfy us for a moment. Now, the lie is that this view of sexuality is new. It's not new at all. When I was in the 10th grade, I went to Pompeii on a school trip, which is kind of crazy. I go to Pompeii. They're like, oh, the volcano exploded. I'm like, sick. We walk through all these different places. We go into a building. This building is just a regular building. You walk in, a bunch of 10th grade boys, okay? And they said this was a place where a lot of crazy stuff happened. And we walked in, saw these doors and all these rooms, and there was these symbols above all of the doors. And we walked in, there was a different sexual position on every single one of the doors. So you can imagine, like 20 grade 10 boys, we're just giggling the whole way through this presentation. We were going through, and the lady basically said people would walk into this room, and whatever they were feeling as a consumer, they wanted this position or that position or that position, they would walk into that room and they would have their desires satisfied. There's this choice, there is this choosing, there is a desire and a product, there is an appetite and a consumable, and this is an ancient thought, but it also has new ways of thinking about it. Think of modern pornography. You go onto the website, you can choose hair color, you can choose ethnicity, you can choose age. It's all towards you as a consumer to have exactly what you want so that you can be satisfied. You hear what's happening? So what's happened nowadays is sex has become this thing. It's become like we have a societal folder for sex. Inside that folder, you have all these kinds of documents. You have homosexuality, heterosexuality, reproductive sex, procreative sex, casual sex, therapeutic sex, bisexuality, transsexuality, monosexuality. You can go on and on and on. And the idea that marriage and sex being conjoined together into one thing has now just become one document and an ever-growing folder, and this one document that we hold so closely is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in importance. Sex has been dislocated by everything else and has become a thing in and of itself. That's the problem. Is that we make sex a thing. And as soon as we observe it to be a thing, then it becomes something that can be observed, bought, sold, traded, exchanged, and advertised. And if we start from this perspective, then sexual experience is something that now has a value, a utility of its own. It can be used, which is why advertisers will say sex sells. It is something that can be used to promote a desire in you so that we can push a product on you, even when that product is not very sexy. You know who has very sexy advertisements? Here are a couple companies. Burger King. What? Folgers Coffee. Quiznos. Lotrimin Fungal Cream. Think about Old Spice ads, right? What is it? It's a jacked guy who just has a 20-pack. He's just in a towel, moving around a bunch of different things. We have sexualized products in order to create a desire so we can satisfy those desires to place things on you. There's a dislocation that has happened. It is now observed and a thing. And you know how we know that it's become dislocated between sex and marriage? OnlyFans, right? It's an adult-oriented website that people go and subscribe to people who are on there to do whatever. 89, they just released the stats on it. 89% of subscribers, both men and women, are married who subscribe to that website. 89%. There is a dislocation between sex and marriage, sex and everything else. The problem is not that sex in and of itself is an issue. It's practicing a kind of mentality of sex that devalues people. Pornography is the act of devaluing human beings to put them to the place of a commodity or a product, not a person. They are a consumable for my appetite and my desire, and we've lost the human being in the act. You hear what I'm saying? This isn't just the way that you use your phones or your computer screens. In high schools or colleges nowadays, when having conversations, you will hear things like, hey bro, what's your body count? The amount of people that you slept with is a number, as if you are collecting human beings of your experience in life, like they're cards or coins. The problem, the problem is we say that we are such a sexually liberated community, but we are not feeling free at all. And we can do whatever we want with whoever we want to, and we say this is going to be the best way of doing this, and yet the West, who has that kind of mentality, is the number one consumer of sexual child exploitation on the internet. Sexual liberation has not made us free. Now, I'm not saying because you have sex outside of marriage, all of a sudden you become some predator. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you have an idea of sex, a lie of sex that begins to practice the act of devaluing human beings, do not be surprised as to where you end up. The Subway illustration. Immediately, we thought we were the ones who were picking the sandwich, eh? Not realizing that, no, you're not the consumer. You're the product. Think of modern dating apps. I have to go on there, put a certain kind of picture, a certain kind of way, put keywords onto the app. Why? Because I'm trying to market myself and advertise myself to other people's wants and desires and needs. I have become the product. And that way has affected our world more ways than we know. Mary Eberstadt wrote this: first, and contrary to conventional depiction, the sexual revolution has proved a disaster for many men and women. And second, its weight has fallen heaviest on the smallest and weakest shoulders in society, even as it has given extra strength to those already strongest and most predatory. So, is Paul only just critiquing the worldly view about sex? No, he's also critiquing the very, very religious view on sex. Why? This is what he says in chapter 7, verse 1. Now, concerning with the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Paul is saying that last part in quotations because he is quoting a common perception of the time. Platonic philosophy has gone through the church, and so all the physicality is bad, spiritual is good. And so people have this perception that having sex is not a good thing. It is something that is a distortion of what is actually true and good. The church has not done a really good job talking about sex in many different ways, and it leads to weird actions in the way that we talk about sex. I remember being like 12 or 13 or whatever when you're about to have like the birds and bees conversation, you know what I'm talking about? And I was in the car with my mom. We were going to go on like a 30, 40-minute drive to go to one of my practices for soccer. And so I'm in the car, and I'm just sitting there hanging out. And this is before, like, phones and headphones and all that you use. So you're kind of just stuck there, right? And we're in the car, and my mom puts the child lock on the window. And I go, oh, no. What is happening right now? She then proceeds to pull out a CD and put the CD into the CD player in the car. And she just makes no eye contact, just eyes on the road, right? And I'm sitting there like, please do not let this happen. And a guy goes on the radio and he goes, let's talk about God's view of sex. And I'm like, oh no, right? And it's 40 minutes of some like old man telling me about how to not do or what. And I'm like, dear Lord, what is going on here, right? I'm 12 years old, 13, all of a sudden this rhetoric, which is like, you are sinful and evil and blah, whatever, right? And I'm like, okay, I guess this is how church folk think about sex. And what's happened to us is we have this kind of attitude where we need to scare you into behavioral change and modification, right? Another story about my mom, because it's my great joy to make fun of her, is... I remember as a kid, we would go to this Chinese restaurant, right? And I was known, like they knew me from a baby, these Chinese waitresses, right? They were just like, they knew exactly what I wanted, blah, 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 whatever. And I was always known to them as the kid who blew the bubbles into the drinks. I was always the bubble kid, right? And one time my mom out of nowhere came to me as I was just going after some bubbles. She said to me, oh my gosh, you hear? There's a new study. I'm like, what, new study? She goes, oh, they say if you blow bubbles into your drink, you're going to get sick. Like, really sick? I'm like, what? She's like, oh, I was surprised too. I don't know. Right? So what do? I stop blowing bubbles into the thing. Why? Because there's this super negative consequence. And the reason why I changed isn't because I, honor the beverage, It's because I'm scared something's going to go wrong with me. And the church has had this kind of rhetoric towards people. If you do X, Y, Z, you are sinful and God is against you. And what happens? It creates a culture that doesn't actually implement any good, but devalues you as a human being. The church has basically become that gym teacher in Mean Girls, where it's like, if you have sex, you will get an STD and something will go wrong with you. That's not proper sexual theology that the Bible offers. Because what it creates is it creates a way of thinking that devalues something so important about being a human. Sexuality is a very important thing about being human. And let's not forget that God is the originator of this idea. It's not against him, it's for him. And so what happens is when we put all of this pressure and shame and guilt on the topic of sex, especially towards young people, we give them this idea that's so messed up, that the way that the church works with this is moral standards and your willpower equals holiness. Right? If we can set the bar high and we make it about your performance and your effort, that's where God's going to love you. It is not true. What happens is that there's no answer to what it means to truly be human. There just becomes a denying of what it means to be human. So no wonder people walk out of the church with a lack of a robust theology about what it means, what sex actually is, the goodness of it. And what happens is shame is applied to individuals. And no wonder they don't want to go and hear about what the church thinks about sex. Philip Yancey wrote this. I know of no greater failure among Christians than in presenting a persuasive point of view on sexuality. Outside the church, people think of a God as the great spoil sport of human sexuality, not its inventor. In a sex-saturated society, even true believers find it hard to accept that traditional Christian morality offers the fullest, most satisfying life. The Pope utters pronouncements, denominations issue position papers, and many Christians ignore them and follow the lead of the rest of society. Surveys reveal little difference between church attenders and non-attenders in the rate of premarital intercourse and cohabitation. Surveys also show that millions of people have left the church in a disgust over its hypocrisy about sex. especially when priests and ministers fail to practice what they preach. The modern critique of just devaluing this aspect of what it means to be human has failed. But the church is not the only place that has a critique on the world. It certainly does. It has this critique about sexuality that's very important. One person wrote this: when you get rid of the Creator, and this is the argument of Romans 1, when you get rid of the Creator, you get rid of design. When you get rid of design, you get rid of purpose. When you get rid of purpose, you get rid of accountability. When you get rid of accountability, you get rid of the need to answer for your choices. When you get rid of people giving an account for their life, you remove the fear of God. And it's the fear of God that's the beginning of wisdom. And when you have no fear of God or no wisdom, all you're left with is total confusion, and this is the moment we find ourselves in as a culture. It's a religious critique against this. But it's not just the religious individuals that have a critique, it's also very secular, smart individuals who have critiqued this view on sexuality. William Good in 1963 wrote a very influential book about the new revolution and family patterns. What he basically said is industrialization changed a lot. Women were more highly valued within the world at this point because of industrialization and modernization. It created a lot more agency. It created a lot more economic independence. And so what it did is it created an environment of autonomy and self-determination that affected both men and women. And he had a really highly optimistic view of what was happening in the 60s. He wrote this: unleashing personal potential, the right to love, to equality within the family, to the establishment of a new marriage when the old has failed. I see the world revolution and family patterns as a part of a still more important revolution that is sweeping the world in our time. The aspiration on the part of billions of people to have the right for the first time to choose for themselves. So he's excited. Now that there's a higher value on both men and women and their own agency and autonomy, this is going to be incredible. The problem is that it went way too far. And as it went too far, what it began to lead was an autonomy that led to independence, not relationships. And so the rates of divorce skyrocketed in the world once this began to happen. And his mood changed. 30 years later, in 1994, William Good wrote the book World Changes in Divorce Patterns, and everything was different for him. Modernity's speed, its capacity to subdue intimate relationships to the dictates of rational production, the mobility that it induces, its tendency to move labor and capital around the world without respect for enduring human relationships have now made the friend into the enemy. Modernization began devouring the family that allowed its birth. His mood changed. But it's not just the sociologists. You would think sexual liberation and a higher value on women's independent choices, the feminists are going to be the ones that are super excited about this, right? And that's exactly what happened. In 1970, early 1980s, feminist scholars celebrated the new culture of divorce and non-marriage as a promising future of creativity and emancipation, especially for women. Not even 10 or 15 years later, feminist writers began to write incessantly about their deep skepticism about these changes. Why? Because of its effects. And what they wrote was this: higher divorce societies have witnessed the rise of a new social phenomenon, the feminization of poverty. This has devastating effects in rich countries, but it's nothing compared to the social denigration produced in less developed ones. The thing of sexual liberation that we all felt was going to be the answer to the problem has become more of the problem than what we started with. And this critique is coming from the church and outside of the church. The individualization and agency of sex has not worked. So what does the Bible say about this? It says something very, very beautiful. Verse 14, and God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Think about what he's talking about, the joining of a human being to this prostitute. Never. Why? What's the reason? Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. What's he trying to say? Well, at the end, he's saying it starts with your connection to God. This one flesh mentality has an analogy to what it means to be connected to God. So it means that this one flesh is not just a physical union, it is a whole life union. If you take the way that you think about joining with God or with Christ, that means when you have common motives, aims, emotions, and desires, this incessant desire for Jesus to, go and affirm and do all of the things towards his Father's glory, then happens with us. The Holy Spirit joins us together and we have the same fervent longing. None of those things are physical, they're emotional, they're spiritual, and we're joining together one and the same. Paul's illustration here is that you're joining to Christ. Sex is an earthly analogy of it. And the earthly analogy of what he's trying to communicate is a total love and a total submission of a complete relationship. That's what sex is intended to be. Sex is a way to say to somebody, I belong completely and exclusively to you. And if you say that to just about everyone, then what you're doing is you're committing a lie. Sex is a nonverbal piece of communication that God has designed to carry a very important message. It's a communication mode. And if you use it in any other context, think about the alarm at the beginning, you begin to destroy its usefulness. The view of sex from the biblical perspective is it's not just a physical union, but it's also a personal transformation. This is how one author says. Far from devaluing sex, Paul here is doing the very opposite. Paul was far ahead of cultural assumptions in perceiving the sexual act of one of self-commitment, which deeply involves the entire person. Paul is saying that sex is intended to be, listen, the full giving of one's entire self to the one whom you belong. F.F. Bruce says this, Paul displays a psychological insight into sexuality which is altogether exceptional by first century standards. He insists that it is an act which by its very nature, once again, engages the entire person in a unique mode of self-disclosure and self-commitment. Paul is not saying that sex is a defiling act, but it's necessary because you need to procreate. He's also not saying that sex is just for your self-gratification or for you to use as some kind of a commodity for your own self-expression. What he's saying, and look at how different this is, that sex is a radical donation of yourself to another human being. It's a radical self-donation that God has invented in such a way that it causes the personal transformation of you and the other. It's not just physicalness. The physicalness is just an analogy of the total life commitment that you and the other are pursuing with one another. And what happens is you change throughout the process. I remember my early years of being married. For some reason, I was just so committed for some reason to awkwardly talk in accents. I don't know why. It was just like a thing I did early in marriage. And one time we were out, and my wife was very much not that way, and we were having this conversation, and she started just pulling out these accents. And I was like, oh no, what have I done to her, right? It was the time, it was the connection. It's like we were becoming one person. It's funny when somebody has a conversation with me, it's like I don't just have my mind in my mind, I have my wife's mind in my mind. Where somebody will say something and I have my reaction to it and her reaction to it. It's like I'm so molded to her that everything that she would react to in a situation, I have present within me. It's a togetherness that's no longer just physical, it's spiritual, it's mental, it's psychological. It's like we have combined into this one person. You know what I'm saying? And this is a bit of an aside, but even in dating relationships, like this beautiful oneness and this radical self-donation leads us to a pretty prominent question when we're thinking about things like marriage. Because one of the primary questions we have to ask ourselves is, this person who I might commit myself to, do I, in my life, want to become more like them? Because that's what's going to happen. Your mannerisms are going to change. You're going to start acting so much more similar. This last week, I hung out with a couple, 61 years of marriage. It was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. They were so snarky and they were so funny and they were making jokes and reaction, and she was finishing his sentences and he was telling her to stop. It was amazing. They were so similar over all of these years. It's like they knew it was like something, it was like a superpower that they had. That's how close together they were. their language unified, their actions unified, their motives, their aims, their purposes, their goals, all of a sudden become one. It's not just a physical act. It was an utter giving of themselves to become more like themselves and change throughout the process. It was a radical self-donation. See, the problem is that we live in a society that it's normal to give your body without giving yourself. There's a break there. We want to give sex, but we want to hold on to our independence. We want to hold on to our life. We want to keep control. We want to love our control. But sex, to the Bible, is a person-shaping mechanism of deep soul and personal transformation. You destroy your commitment apparatus as soon as you start giving it to people who you radically do not want to self-donate to. That's his whole point about the prostitute. If you want to give of yourself, of who you are towards another person, make sure that the confines of that relationship are able to support such a commitment. You can't just give it to anybody else. And now you hear the difference. This is not an appetite to be satisfied. This is not a product to be consumed. It's not something that I receive. The question's no longer so much about what I am entitled to as much who am I responsible for. I'm giving all of who I am to somebody. And you know how vulnerable that is? You know how terrifying that is. To all of my fears and all of my thoughts and all of my dreams, I'm offering to someone in whole life commitment. That's what Paul is saying your sex life is. It's just an analogy of a whole person commitment to another person. And you see how opposite that is in the world? Because it's no longer a sexuality that devalues human being. It absolutely affirms the value in a person. It tells them, I see you, right? When I got married to my wife, and we were able to do these things, it's like me saying to her, I value you so much that I want to become more like you, and I want you to become the primary means as to which I become more like Jesus. You see how different that is? It's not just a scorecard that I get to go and boast about to my friends. It's a person that I'm unifying to in every possible way of my life. It changes everything. It becomes an affirmation of another human being, and all of a sudden what this scene is no longer this thing to be afraid of. It is the most beautiful commitment that you could offer someone else. But don't let the lie get into your mind. We live in such an economic world. Everything has like this underpinning of economics all the time, this transactional relationship that we have with friends and whatever. That's why, and maybe this is too far, and that's fine. But I'm so hesitant about this, even like the language of partner. When we say oh, this is my partner or something. Because it has almost this underpinning of economic transactional relationship. It's like we have this mutual contract, and as soon as that person doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, the contract is over and I'm out. If they don't do what I want or what we initially agreed upon, we can just dissolve the partnership, and it's our way. We kind of do it in this way that's so authentic. You're so authentic to yourself. Leave him because you're being so true to you. And it's like we culturally exonerate people throughout the process. And now, I'm not saying that when you commit to someone, you should receive all the abuse or be acceptable with adultery. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we create these caveats in a contract with individuals that allow us a way out because we don't actually want to commit. And fidelity and faithfulness has been changed and reinterpreted not as a commitment to somebody else, but a truth to just me. I now owe it to myself to end this unhappy marriage because it's not fulfilling the ideas and expectations that I had. This idea of partnership is a false concept of relationship that requires romance and idea of sex, which is essentially self-serving, not self-giving. This is what one Jewish scholar wrote about this. A contract is a transaction. A covenant is a relationship. Or put it slightly different, a contract is about interests and a covenant is about identity. It's about you and me coming together to form us. That's why a contract benefits, but a covenant transforms. I love pita pit. You guys like pita? I love pita, and so I went to the restaurant and I ordered a pita. I love pita. And I ordered the pita, and they were going to deliver my pita at the other end because I love pita so much. And so I walked over to go get my pita, and as soon as I walked over to get my pita, the person was handing me my pita, but I had put my phone where the pita was supposed to go, and so I grabbed the pita because I obviously valued the pita more than my phone, and I grabbed the pita, because I love pita, and I pulled the pita, and as I pulled it, my phone dropped off of the counter, and I was like, oh my goodness, and I could have dropped the pita to grab my phone, but I love the pita. So the phone fell, and as the phone fell, it fell in that kind of angle that you know you're not supposed to fall at. It was right in the corner, and as soon as it hit the ground, it was like all slow motion. And everybody in the room's like kind of looking at what happened. And so I get down, still have the pita because I love the pita. I go down and I grab the phone and I turn the phone over and the whole thing is shattered. And everyone in the room's like, ooh, right? But I was in a weird spot because this sucked, but man, I love pita. You know what I mean? So I had all this stuff. And as I'm grabbing the phone around, just listen to what happened to my brain, okay? Okay? Just listen to what happened to my brain and think about technology and things that we do and the economic experience of everything, right? I turn the phone over, I look at it, and what's the first thing that comes to my mind? I gotta get a new phone. Right? I gotta get a new phone. What happens when the computer breaks? You get a new computer. What happens when the internet's not working? You get new internet. So what happens? What happens when the relationship breaks down? Just get a new one. What happens when the thing's not working like it's supposed to? I'll just get a new one. And we begin to realize as we live in a culture that practices replacement rather than fixing. And we've allowed that to seep into every part of our life. And it's a lie. We make a covenant to someone. And it's not just a secular critique, this is a critique of the church too. Constantly we say these things like sex and marriage are going to complete you. It's going to make you who God really wants you to be. Jesus was single. He's not married. He was humanity perfected. And if we keep using jargon and rhetoric like this, like your kids and your family are going to complete you, like this is the only way you're really going to be human, then no wonder singles feel so devalued in church. It's simply not true that sex or a person is going to complete you, as if that's like the major marker of self-realization for you in the world. No. We have this weird language. Oh, honey, one day you're just going to find Mr. Right. No. Once you get married, you begin to realize everybody was always Mr. and Mrs. Wrong, never Mr. and Mrs. Right. And it's not about choosing someone who you have this insane, relationship with, and you go, oh, they're administrative, but I'm the fun of the party, and everyone looks at you, oh my gosh, opposites attract. Like, what? Like, no, that's not how this works. It's not about you jumping into this hyper-emotional and romantic phase of your life that allows you to become exactly who you want to be. I'm going to complete it as long as I find so-and-so. No. The truth is we are all, if you get married, marry the wrong person. And what we discover that it's very hard to marry Mr. and Mrs. Right a lifetime over. It's difficult and it's hard to do. And what matters in Christian marriage and the view of sex is how we learn to love the people to whom we have committed. It's not so much about discovering our romantic match, the person that completes us, but rather it's about being people who, by the grace of God, are capable to living up to the promises that we made when we had absolutely no idea about how the person in front of us was going to change. See how different that is? A relationship that's strong enough and flexible enough to take into account the fact that human beings become different over time. Self-fulfillment cannot be the goal of Christian life. I cannot buy into a lie that turns all of who I am bent to my own selfishness. That's not how this is going to work. Contracts have clauses in them when extraneous circumstances come into it that we did not expect that allow us to get out of those contracts. A covenant does not have that. Because the covenant knows about those things that will happen and accounts for them when it happens. Marriage is simply the gift of time that we give to one another amidst the uncertainties of life that we stick to. This is a good thing for us. Why? Because we can, in confidence, make promises to unconditionally give ourselves away because the one who we belong to first and foremost did that for us. When you think about your relationship with Christ, do you want a covenant or a contract? Whoa, you disappointed me again. Okay, let's break up this relationship. No, that's not how Christ is to us. You see how beautiful this language is of self-donation, of giving of yourself radically towards another human being? Jesus made a covenant with us through his own work on the cross, through his death, through his resurrection. And what he's saying is that our identities as men and women are foremost in his. It's foremost in him. That his love can withstand your personality change. That his commitment to you is not thrown off by these weird things that happen in life. His love for you is certain regardless of what happens. This is what Christ's commitment is to you. That's what it means to be joined to him. And it didn't start with us accepting Christ as if we're doing him a favor. No. The radical donation that affirms who you are came from him when the divine took on humanity and died on a cross. There is no moment of more radical self-donation than that. There is no affirmation of worth or value more than that, which is why we can see that sex is an analogy of this. To give total love and total submission in a complete relationship, Christ has given us the basis so that we can look at another weird human being who will fail us, who will say the wrong things, who won't remember, who won't do the acts that we just hope that they can do, that we actually have a basis of a covenant that allows us to love someone while they are developing and changing. See how different this is? There's not a devaluing of someone. It is an absolute valuing of somebody. They are no longer a product to be consumed. They are the most life-giving mechanism that you have in your life to become more like Jesus. And the question you have to ask yourself is, am I entitled to this person, or am I responsible for this person in becoming us, not just me and you? And once we have that, man, is sex a very different way of living. Don't give in to the lie that the devaluing of human beings in the sexual practice is some way more liberating for yourself. To think of marriage and sexuality as one of the most beautiful things that you can commit to. Why? Because it's giving of all of who you are to someone and saying to them, I trust you. Father, we thank you as we sit here in this time and as we think about this new way of thinking about what you have for us. That foremost, the radical self-donation was the one that you offered and gave. That the change that has valued us rather than devalued us has been offered through Christ on the cross. That we look at people who will fail us and we can actually commit to them through the process because you have first committed to us, even though we have sin rampant within our lives. That you've accounted for those things. You've actually loved us in spite of us. I pray that the lies that either come outside of the church or sometimes even inside of the church don't change this thing that you have used for your great glory that you invented and thought of. So I pray that we think about it differently. I pray that we act differently. I pray that we commit differently. I pray that we value differently. And I ask that you would just do a deep work in our hearts. Change us one day at a time. So, Father, we thank you. We love you. In Jesus' name we want to pray. Amen. Thank you all so much for listening to that message as we're thinking about all these things in the church, and especially when we had this kind of conversation about intimacy and sex. We heard so much about joining together to become more like the other, this valuing view of human peoples. And so as we think in kind of those terms, what we would love to do is join into the church. It's not so much what I am entitled to, but who I am responsible for. You can do that by joining a site at Village. You can go and find all of that online, or to join a community group to be in communion with people week after week after week. We'd love for you to take those next steps. Thank you so much for watching our service. We'll see you next time.